Somewhere in ancient India, a philosopher stood up in a marketplace and said something so dangerous that the priests would spend the next 1,000 years trying to erase him. He did not deny one God. He denied all of them. He did not question one ritual. He called every ritual a profitable scam invented by the people who performed it. He did not offer a different path to the afterlife. He said there is no afterlife. He said that when your body burns on the funeral pyre, you are gone, completely and permanently gone, and that the smoke rising from the flames is the only transcendence you will ever know. His name was Brihaspati. His followers became known as the Charvakas. And the school of thought they built was the only fully materialist philosophy ever to emerge from the ancient Indian world. Every other school, no matter how different, agreed that there was something beyond the visible, a soul, a cycle of rebirth, a path toward liberation, an ultimate truth that reason alone could not touch. The Charvakas disagreed. They said the body is what you are. The senses are all you have. Pleasure is the only thing worth pursuing. And anyone who tells you otherwise is either deceiving you or deceiving themselves. These ideas were recorded, debated, replied to at length. And then, systematically, the original texts were destroyed. What we have left of Charvaka philosophy today exists almost entirely in the writings of its enemies. The Buddhists quoted them to refute them. The Jains described their arguments to disprove them. The Hindu Brahmins preserved their sayings in order to mock them. And yet, even filtered through centuries of hostile commentary, the ideas survived, sharp, uncomfortable, and strangely familiar to anyone alive today. Tonight, we are going to follow those ideas all the way down. We will talk about how a philosophy built on pleasure and perception became a threat serious enough to be erased. We will ask what it means that the only school of ancient Indian thought to reject the soul entirely was also the one destroyed most thoroughly. We will look at the arguments the Charvakas made against karma, against inference, against the authority of priests and sacred texts, and we will ask whether those arguments still hold. We will talk about pleasure, about whether a philosophy of pleasure is actually the most honest philosophy possible, or the most dangerous. About whether the pursuit of your own happiness, with nothing above it and no one to answer to, leads to freedom, or to something much darker. We will follow the thread from ancient India all the way into questions that every person alive right now carries around with them, whether they know it or not. What do you actually know? What are you actually living for? And if this life is the only one you get, what does that do to the way you spend it? Before we begin, if you found your way to this channel, consider staying. Maybe meaning exists for exactly this kind of exploration. Slow, unhurried, the kind of thinking that works best late at night or in the half-dark before sleep. Subscribe if this is your kind of place. And now, let us begin. This video is made for rest, for slow listening, for the kind of thinking that does not need to arrive anywhere. If you fall asleep during it, that is fine. The paradoxes will settle in on their own. The questions will wait for you in the morning. There is nothing here that demands anything of you except a little quiet and a little willingness to sit with ideas that have no easy answers. Settle in. Let your body go heavy. And let us go back 2,500 years to a world where the question of what you are allowed to believe was a matter of life and death. To understand what made Charvaka so remarkable, you have to understand the world it appeared in, because this was not a world of casual disagreement. This was a world where ideas carried enormous stakes, where getting your philosophy wrong was not merely an intellectual failure. It could determine your place in society for your entire life, across every lifetime that followed. The Indian world of roughly 600 years before the Common Era was one of extraordinary philosophical ferment. The old Vedic order, the system of priests and sacrifices and sacred texts that had organized society for centuries, was cracking under pressure. New ideas were breaking through everywhere. The Buddha was teaching. Mahavira was reforming Jainism. Dozens of wandering philosophers were moving through the cities and forests, gathering followers, debating each other in public, challenging assumptions that had seemed permanent. The central organizing idea of that world was the soul. Not a soul in the vague Western sense, not something you had and might or might not survive death, but the Atman, the essential self that was permanent, unchanging, and identical at its deepest level with the ultimate reality of the universe. The entire system of Indian thought, in virtually all its forms, was built around this. What you did in this life determined what kind of being you would be in the next one. Karma was the mechanism. Rebirth was the consequence. Liberation from the cycle of rebirth was the goal. And the priests, the Brahmins, were the ones who knew how to navigate all of it. This system was not merely a set of beliefs. It was a social order. It was economy. It was law. The rituals required priests, and priests required payment. The caste system, the hierarchy of birth that determined what kind of work you could do and who you could marry and what part of the city you could live in, was justified by karma. If you were born into suffering, that was the consequence of your previous lives. If you were born into privilege, that was a reward. The system was cosmic and therefore unchallengeable, and the people at the top of it had every reason to keep it that way. Into this world stepped the Charvakas with a single, devastating question. How do you actually know any of that is true? How do you know the soul exists? Have you seen it? Have you touched it? Can you weigh it, measure it, observe it in any way? Or have you simply been told about it by people who benefit from your belief in it? How do you know karma operates across multiple lifetimes? You cannot remember your previous life. You cannot observe the mechanism that connects your behavior now to your birth conditions then. You are taking the word of a class of people whose income depends on performing the rituals that are supposed to manage that mechanism. How do you know the Vedas are the word of the divine? They were written by men, specific men, in specific places, at specific times. The fact that they say they are divine does not make them divine, any more than a letter claiming to be from a king is actually royal correspondence. These were not idle questions. They were directed, precise, and aimed at the foundations of a system of power. And the people with power noticed. The word Charvaka appears in the ancient Indian epic, the Mahabharata. In one version of the story, a demon named Charvaka stands in the court of the victorious king Yudhishthira and denounces him as a murderer, a man who killed his own cousins for the sake of a kingdom. The assembled priests are outraged, not by what Charvaka says, but by who he is. They burn him alive with their sacred sounds, with the power of their mantras. The demon dies. The righteous continue. It is hard to read that story without noticing what it is actually saying. The one who asks the uncomfortable question, who says what no one wants to hear, is cast as the demon. The ones who silence him are the holy. There is a pattern there that recurs throughout history in ways that are worth sitting with. The philosophical foundation of Charvaka begins with a single, radical claim about knowledge. The Charvakas said that perception is the only valid source of knowledge. Not inference, not tradition, not testimony, not sacred texts. Only what your senses directly encounter can be trusted as real. This sounds simple. It sounds almost obvious. But follow it to where it actually leads, and you will see why it was treated as explosive. Every other system of Indian philosophy recognized multiple valid sources of knowledge. Perception was one of them, certainly. But there was also anumana, inference, the ability to reason from what you observe to conclusions about things you cannot directly observe. And there was sabda, testimony, the authority of texts and teachers. The entire system of Vedic knowledge rested on the assumption that testimony from a reliable source, specifically the Vedas themselves, was as valid as direct perception. The Charvakas said no. Inference can only be trusted when it is based on observed correlations. You see smoke and you infer fire because you have observed that relationship consistently. But inference used to prove things about the soul, about karma, about liberation, about any reality beyond the physical, is making claims that have never been observed at all. You are not inferring fire from smoke. You are inferring fire from the concept of smoke, from someone else's description of smoke, from a tradition that says smoke implies fire, and that is not inference. That is hope dressed in logical clothing. This argument is still live. It is the same argument that runs through the history of empiricism in Western philosophy, the same argument that Hume made in the 18th century when he challenged our right to infer causes from observations, the same argument that underlies scientific skepticism today. We accept theories based on evidence. The burden of proof lies with those making the claim. The soul has not been proven. Rebirth has not been observed, therefore they cannot be accepted. But the Charvakas went further than just demanding evidence. They pointed out that the people most loudly insisting on the reality of the soul and karma were the same people most directly rewarded by that belief. The Brahmins performed rituals to manage karma. The rituals required payment. A system of thought that says your ritual performing is cosmically essential is a system of thought that serves the ritual performers. This does not prove the system is wrong, but it is absolutely a reason to look at it with clear eyes, rather than inherited reverence. The Charvakas had a word for this kind of motivated reasoning. They pointed to the Vedic literature itself and noted that the prescriptions in it tend to benefit the priests who wrote it. The injunctions to perform expensive sacrifices, to maintain the authority of caste, to accept your current suffering as karma, all of these work in favor of a specific group of people. An objective analysis would expect to find exactly this in a self-serving ideology. And this is precisely what the Vedas contain. This was not polite philosophical disagreement. This was a direct accusation of institutional fraud aimed at the most powerful religious establishment in the subcontinent. And the institutional response was entirely predictable. The Charvakas became the villains of the ancient Indian philosophical world. They were called Nastika, unbelievers. They were described as holding views appropriate to demons. Their philosophical sophistication was either ignored or deliberately distorted. The hedonist label was stuck to them and stretched to the point where any careful listener would simply dismiss them as irresponsible pleasure seekers. What gets destroyed most thoroughly is rarely the weakest argument. Usually, it is the one that touches something true in a place that power cannot afford to acknowledge. If the soul does not exist, then what are you? This is not a question the Charvakas ignored. They had a precise and surprisingly sophisticated answer. You are a particular arrangement of matter. You are made of 4 elements: earth, water, fire, and air. These elements combine in specific configurations, and when those configurations are sufficiently complex, something new emerges, something that does not exist in any of the individual elements alone. Consciousness. The Charvakas had a name for this kind of emergence. They pointed to the example of fermentation. Take grain, water, and warmth. None of these individually has the property of intoxication, but combine them in the right way, allow them to interact over time, and a new quality appears that was not present in any of the ingredients. Intoxication is real. It exists, but it is not a separate substance added from outside. It is a property that emerges from the combination. Consciousness, they argued, works the same way. Your capacity to feel, to think, to be aware of yourself and your surroundings is not evidence of a soul separate from your body. It is what happens when matter organizes itself in the particular way that a living brain does. It is real. It is yours. But when the body dies and the configuration dissolves, the consciousness that depended on that configuration dissolves with it. This is not a medieval idea. This is an idea that the most sophisticated neuroscience and philosophy of mind today is still wrestling with. The question of how physical processes in the brain give rise to subjective experience, what philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness, remains one of the deepest unsolved problems in science. The Charvakas did not solve it. But they did stake out a position. Consciousness is what the physical does at sufficient complexity. And they staked that out more than 2,000 years before anyone invented the word neuroscience. The implications of this position are enormous. If consciousness is what matter does, then death is final. When this particular configuration of earth, water, fire, and air dissolves, the experience it generated ends. There is no passage to another life. There is no accumulation of karmic debt that follows you into your next birth. There is no self that survives to be reborn, or liberated, or condemned. This is one of those ideas that sounds abstract when stated in dry philosophical terms, and becomes something entirely different when you sit with it in the dark and apply it to yourself. Your body is asleep right now, or close to it. Your mind is drifting, and somewhere in the background of that experience is the question, is this all there is? Is the awareness that is listening to these words just what your neurons do when they fire in the particular pattern they are firing right now? And when those neurons stop firing for the last time, is the awareness simply over? The Charvakas said yes, and they said this is not a reason for despair. It is a reason for clarity. Every moment you are alive. You are having the only kind of experience that exists. There is no other world to save it for. There is no future self who will receive the reward of your present self-denial. There is only this. And this is astonishing. The question is what you do with that. If this life is all there is, and if consciousness ends with the body, then what is the rational thing to pursue? The Charvakas had a clear answer: pleasure. Karma, the satisfaction of the senses, the enjoyment of food, of physical love, of beauty, of company, of all the things that the living body is capable of experiencing. This is where the Charvakas are most consistently misrepresented, and where the most interesting philosophical questions actually live. The label of hedonism has a bad reputation. When we hear it applied to an ancient philosophy, we tend to imagine something cartoonish, mindless self-indulgence. The abandonment of all restraint. Eat and drink and take what you want and consider no one else. This is the portrait that the opponents of Charvaka painted, and it stuck. But the actual Charvaka position was more careful than that. Some scholars have argued that the charge of reckless hedonism was itself a deliberate distortion, part of the project of discrediting a school that threatened powerful interests. The original Charvaka texts are gone. What remains are summaries written by critics, and critics have a habit of presenting the least charitable version of their opponent's views. What we can reconstruct suggests something more nuanced. The Charvakas recognized that some pleasures come with pain attached, and that wisdom involves attending to this. The pleasure of drinking fermented wine is real. The pain of the morning after is also real. The pleasure of taking something that belongs to someone else might be immediate, but the social consequences that follow are painful. A philosophy of pleasure that ignores these connections is not wise. It is just impatient. The deeper question the Charvakas were asking is this: given that the only things we can actually verify are things we can perceive, and given that the most directly perceptible feature of experience is its hedonic quality, its pleasantness or unpleasantness, should that quality not be the ground on which we make decisions? Every other ethical system, they observed, was built on something that could not be directly perceived. Karma requires you to believe in a mechanism that operates across lifetimes that no one has observed. Dharma requires you to trust texts written by humans who claim divine authority. Liberation from the cycle of rebirth requires you to want something, namely liberation, that you will only appreciate once you have it, which no one who has achieved it has ever come back to confirm. The Charvaka position is not that pleasure is the highest good in some abstract, ultimate sense. It is that pleasure is the only good that can actually be verified. Everything else is a wager. The priest offering you salvation is offering you a product you cannot inspect, for a price payable now. The Charvaka is saying, before you pay, ask yourself whether you have ever seen the product. Ask yourself who benefits from your trust. There is something there that echoes down through history and arrives right here. Every ideology, every religion, every political movement asks you to sacrifice something present and certain for something future and uncertain. The Charvaka asks, are you sure that trade is worth making? Have you looked carefully at who is asking you to make it? The Charvakas reserved their sharpest skepticism for the institution of ritual, and this is where the philosophy becomes most directly political. In the Vedic system, the rituals performed by Brahmin priests were not optional cultural practices. They were cosmic necessities. The right sacrifices, performed correctly, maintained the order of the universe. They ensured rain, prosperity, victory in battle. They managed the transition of the dead to their next life. They accumulated and redistributed spiritual merit in ways that ordinary people could not access without priestly intermediation. This placed the Brahmins at the center of everything. You needed them for birth ceremonies, marriage ceremonies, death ceremonies. You needed them to consult on auspicious dates, to perform sacrifices at moments of crisis, to recite the texts that could not be recited by people of lower caste. They were indispensable, and indispensability in any system tends to be the foundation of power. The Charvakas looked at this arrangement and made an observation that sounds almost too simple to be revolutionary. If the benefit of the ritual cannot be observed, how do we know the ritual produces any benefit at all? You perform a sacrifice to ensure rain. It rains. But did it rain because of the sacrifice? Or did it rain because rain comes when the conditions for rain exist? You cannot run the experiment both ways. You cannot perform the sacrifice in one universe and skip it in another and compare the results. The correlation between ritual and outcome is exactly what you would expect from chance. And yet the correlation is treated as confirmation. The Charvakas went further. They looked at the specific content of the Vedic prescriptions and noticed something. The texts that said sacrifice was essential also specified that the sacrifice had to be performed by Brahmins and that the Brahmins had to be compensated. The texts that described the karmic merit of generosity specified that the most meritorious form of generosity was giving to Brahmins. The texts that outlined the cosmic order happened to put the people writing the texts at the top of it. This was, in the Charvaka view, not coincidence. This was the oldest con in the history of organized society, the people with power defining the rules that sustain their power, and calling those rules divine, so that challenging them becomes not merely imprudent, but sacrilegious. One fragment attributed to the Charvaka tradition puts this with memorable directness. It describes the Vedic ritual of Agnihotra, the daily fire sacrifice, and asks whether anyone has ever seen a dead person achieve better conditions through the prayers said over their ashes. It observes that if the merit of giving to Brahmins is so great that it follows the giver beyond death, it is strange that this doctrine happens to have been developed by Brahmins. There is a sentence attributed to the Charvaka tradition that cuts even deeper. It says, "The one who claims that killing animals in sacrifice is a religious duty has no knowledge of right and wrong, or perhaps has too much." Because there is an obvious beneficiary of the doctrine that killing animals for priests is divinely mandated, and that beneficiary is the priests who eat the animals. This argument is not merely historical. The structure it describes: authority self-referentially validating itself, power claiming divine justification for arrangements that happen to favor power. That structure is not confined to ancient India. Every generation discovers it somewhere and has to decide what to do with it. The most technically sophisticated part of Charvaka philosophy is its challenge to inference. And it is worth spending time here because it cuts to the heart of something genuinely difficult. The Charvakas did not simply say that inference was useless. Some of them acknowledged conditional inference. If you have directly observed a consistent relationship between two things, you can reasonably infer that one follows from the other. You have seen many times that where there is smoke, there is fire. When you see smoke in a place you cannot directly observe, you can infer fire with some confidence. But this kind of inference has strict limits. You can only infer relationships you have observed. And here the Charvakas made a point that is still philosophically live. You cannot observe universal relationships. You have seen smoke and fire together many times, but you have not seen all possible instances of smoke. You cannot be certain that there is no case where smoke occurs without fire, because you have not examined every case. Your inference rests on a generalization, and generalizations are always incomplete. Apply this to the claims of religion and metaphysics, and the ground becomes very shaky. You infer the existence of karma from the observation that, sometimes, bad people seem to suffer and good people seem to prosper. But you have also observed the opposite countless times. The inference does not hold. You infer the existence of the soul from the experience of consciousness. But the Charvakas argue that consciousness can be explained by the physical without requiring the addition of a non-physical substance. The inference to the soul adds something unnecessary. This is the principle of parsimony, what Western philosophers later called Occam's razor. Do not multiply entities beyond necessity. If the observable can be explained without the soul is unnecessary. If karma is not needed to explain the distribution of suffering in the world, and a glance at actual human experience suggests it fails spectacularly at explaining that distribution, then karma should not be assumed. The Charvakas took this further still. They pointed to testimony, the authority of teachers and texts, and asked why testimony should be trusted at all. The person giving testimony could be mistaken. They could be lying. They could be repeating what they were told by someone who was mistaken or lying. The chain of transmission is only as reliable as its weakest link, and it stretches back so far that you cannot check any of the links. The Vedas are reliable, says the Brahmin, because they were revealed by the divine. How do you know they were revealed by the divine? Asks the Charvaka. Because the Vedas say so, says the Brahmin. The Charvakas called this circular, and it is. It is precisely the kind of circular reasoning that epistemologists have worried about ever since. You cannot use a text to validate itself. You cannot use a source to prove its own reliability. And yet this is exactly what virtually every tradition of revealed religion does, because there is no external place to stand that would validate the revelation without requiring some other unprovable assumption. This argument troubled the opponents of Charvaka enough that they devoted substantial energy to trying to answer it. The Buddhist philosopher Dharmakirti spent considerable effort on the epistemology of testimony. The Hindu philosophical tradition developed complex theories of what made the Vedas reliable. The Mimamsa school, one of the 6 orthodox systems of Hindu philosophy, developed the doctrine of the self-validating character of the Vedas, arguing that valid knowledge is self-certifying and that the Vedas have a special status that exempts them from the ordinary requirements of proof. The responses were sophisticated and often brilliant, but the original question kept reasserting itself. What do you actually know, and how do you actually know it? The Charvakas also pressed on what philosophers today call the problem of other minds. You know your own experience directly. You know you feel pain because you feel it. But how do you know that other people feel pain? You infer it from their behavior, from the sounds they make, from the way they flinch and withdraw. But you have never experienced their pain directly. You are inferring something internal from something external. This inference feels overwhelmingly reasonable, but it rests on an assumption that other people's inner lives work the same way yours does, that the same external behavior maps to the same internal state. The Charvakas use this to challenge compassion-based ethics. If your certainty about the suffering of others rests on inference, and if inference is less reliable than direct perception, then ethical systems built on concern for others' suffering are built on shakier epistemological ground than they appear. This sounds cold. It is cold, but it is honest about the degree of certainty that is actually available. The deeper point that Charvakas were making is this: most of our confident ethical and metaphysical beliefs rest on inference from perception, not on perception itself. The moment you start asking about the quality of the inference, the foundations start to feel less solid. The question is not whether to stop inferring, because you cannot live without inference, but to become aware of which inferences are well grounded and which are leaps into the dark dressed as steps across solid ground. If you find yourself lying quietly in the dark, asking what you actually know for certain, then you are, in a certain sense, continuing the work of Brihaspati, and you are in good company. Every serious philosopher who has ever lived has ended up there eventually. Here is the thing about the Charvakas that no one who merely summarizes them can fully convey. Their texts are gone. We know what they thought primarily because their opponents quoted them in order to argue against them. This is not an unusual situation in the history of philosophy. We know quite a bit about many ancient thinkers, primarily through the writings of those who disagreed with them. But in the case of Charvaka, the discrepancy between what must have existed and what actually survived is particularly stark. The foundational text of the school was called the Bahaspatya Sutras, attributed to Brihaspati. By most accounts, it was a substantial philosophical work. It argued against inference, against testimony, against the reality of the soul, against the authority of the Vedas. It presumably made these arguments with care, with examples, with the kind of detailed reasoning that a philosophical tradition capable of sustaining sophisticated opponents for more than 1,000 years would have to possess. That text does not exist today. We have approximately 60 fragments, preserved in works that were written to refute them. We have the enemy's version of the Charvaka argument. Think about what that means for the way you understand the tradition. Every summary you read of what the Charvakas believed was written by someone who found those beliefs dangerous or contemptible. The most detailed account comes from a 14th century Hindu philosopher named Madhava, who wrote a comprehensive survey of Indian philosophical schools and gave more space to Charvaka than most. But Madhava was a committed Vedantin, and his account is framed as a refutation. He is showing you the Charvaka position in order to dismantle it. His summary may be accurate. It may not be. There is no way to check. The Charvakas were silenced not all at once, but gradually. The social pressure against materialist thinking in a culture organized around karma and rebirth was enormous. The institutional power of the Brahmin class, which had every practical reason to suppress a philosophy that called the entire Vedic system a self-serving fraud, was real and persistent. The specific destructions were probably not dramatic book burnings, but something quieter and more thorough. Neglect, marginalization, the gradual cessation of copying and transmission, the disappearance of the tradition from the places where it might have been studied. By the 12th or 13th century, Charvaka as a living school was gone. What remained were the quotations in the texts of its opponents, preserved in precisely the form those opponents chose to preserve them. Dhyana, an old indigenous wisdom, teaches us, if you want to hear yourself, you need silent days. The Charvakas never got their silence. They got something worse. They got to be heard only in the voice of those who hated what they were saying. What would it mean to try to reconstruct a philosophy from its enemy's summary? You would have to read carefully for the moments where the opponent is more generous than strictly necessary. You would have to notice when the argument attributed to the Charvakas is stronger than the refutation that follows it. You would have to look for the places where the very effort to discredit them reveals how seriously they were taken. And when you do that, what you find is a tradition that was sophisticated enough to require sophisticated responses. A tradition that asked questions powerful enough that the answers to them took centuries and produced some of the most important philosophical writing in the Indian tradition. The power of an idea is sometimes measured by the fear it generates in those who hold power. The Charvaka attitude toward pleasure is not as simple as seek it always. There is a passage in the fragments that expresses something more careful. Since pleasure inevitably involves some admixture of pain, the wise person seeks to maximize the one while minimizing the other. The point is not blind pursuit. It is clear-eyed management of the only currency that demonstrably matters. This is a genuinely interesting ethical position, and it becomes more interesting when you compare it to what the alternative traditions were actually asking people to do. The Vedic system asked you to perform rituals and endure their costs, the time, the expense, the social obligation, in order to accumulate merit for a future life you will not remember. The expected return on investment is indefinite. The mechanism is unverifiable. The benefit, if any, is separated from the action by the span of an entire lifetime or more. Buddhism asks you to recognize that desire itself is the source of suffering, and to work toward the elimination of desire, not its satisfaction. The goal is liberation from the cycle of rebirth. But this goal is only fully appreciated once achieved, by a being who, if the Buddhist doctrine is correct, will no longer have the kind of individual consciousness that could appreciate anything. Jainism asked for even more radical renunciation. Some Jain ascetics took their commitment to non-violence to the point of refusing to exhale for fear of harming microorganisms in the air. The tradition of ritual fasting unto death existed as an expression of the ultimate detachment from the body. Against all of this, the Charvaka position is almost jarringly reasonable. You are a physical being. Pleasure is real. Pain is real. These are the only things you can verify directly. The ethical task is to live in a way that contains more of the first and less of the second, and to do this with sufficient wisdom that your pursuit of pleasure does not create the kind of social chaos that ultimately produces pain for you and everyone around you. Is this selfish? Opponents of Charvaka always said so, but the accusation deserves examination. The alternative systems ask you to renounce present pleasure for future rewards that have not been demonstrated to exist. In what sense is it more virtuous to sacrifice for an unverifiable future than to engage honestly with a verifiable present? And who benefits when large numbers of people are taught to suppress their worldly desires and accept their present conditions as karmic justice? There is something the Charvaka tradition never quite said, but that is implicit in its whole direction. The acceptance of suffering as karmic necessity is a tool of social control. If you believe that your poverty or your caste status or your suffering is the result of your actions in a previous life, you are less likely to challenge the social arrangements that produce that poverty or that hierarchy or that suffering. You are more likely to work on your internal condition than on the external world. You are more likely to invest in rituals that are supposed to improve your next life than in political action that might improve this one. The Charvakas were pointing at this, and the people they were pointing at knew it. Return for a moment to the demon in the Mahabharata. The story is brief. Yudhishthira has just won the Great War. The Battle of Kurukshetra is over. Hundreds of thousands of men are dead. The righteous king has prevailed, and he is being celebrated at his coronation in the city of Hastinapura. Then a figure appears among the Brahmins assembled for the ceremony. He is in Brahmin disguise. His name is Charvaka, and he represents the demon army. He stands before the new king and says the most uncomfortable thing that can be said at a coronation. He says, "You are a killer. You have murdered your own kinsmen. You have slaughtered the sons of your teachers. You are here celebrating the accomplishment of mass slaughter. What exactly are we honoring today? The assembled Brahmins respond by chanting mantras. The demon is burned alive by the sacred sounds. The ceremony continues. What the story does not linger on is whether the demon was wrong. Yudhishthira did kill his cousins. He did kill the sons of his teachers. The war he participated in was one of the greatest catastrophes in the legendary history of India. The Mahabharata itself spends enormous time on Yudhishthira's anguish over exactly what Charvaka accuses him of. The grief is real. The moral weight of what was done is real. The epic does not pretend otherwise, but the demon who names it is burned. And the naming of it, the direct statement of what actually happened without the ritual framing that makes it acceptable, is treated as an act of demonic subversion. There is something in this story that is worth sitting with for a very long time. Every culture has a version of this. The person who names what is actually happening. The voice that refuses to accept the ritual framing. The one who says, "I know what we are calling this, but I also know what it is." And the response is rarely argument. The response is usually the social equivalent of chanting mantras. Ostracization, dismissal. The person is labeled something that puts them outside the category of people whose observations count. Demon, troublemaker, nihilist, cynic. The Charvakas were relentlessly labeled in this way, and the label stuck, in part because they sometimes earned it. If your philosophy reduces to pursue pleasure and reject everything that cannot be sensed, it is not difficult to paint that as selfishness, as the abandonment of all social obligation, as the philosophy of someone who will take whatever they want and justify it by saying there is no karma to catch up with them. Some of the Charvakas may have used the philosophy exactly that way. The fragments include some that do sound, in their brevity and their cheerfulness about the costs of pleasure, like they might be the work of someone who simply wanted permission to be selfish and found it in epistemology. But this is true of every philosophical tradition. Every system of thought attracts people who use it to justify what they already wanted to do. The Christians who went to war against heretics and the Christians who sheltered refugees both claimed the same scripture. The Buddhists who used meditation to open their hearts, and the Buddhists who used doctrine to justify political hierarchy, both descended from the same enlightenment. The Charvakas who asked honest questions about the foundations of knowledge, and the Charvakas who used that skepticism as an excuse for every self-serving behavior imaginable, both called themselves followers of Brihaspati. The question is not whether a philosophy can be misused. Every philosophy can be misused. The question is, what is actually at its center? There is a tension at the heart of Charvaka that its proponents either did not fully notice or chose not to address, and it is worth sitting with honestly. The philosophy says, pursue pleasure. But pleasure is not simple. The pleasures of the body are direct and easy to understand. Food, warmth, physical love, rest. But human beings also experience pleasures that are harder to categorize. The pleasure of understanding something. The pleasure of loyalty to a friend over a long time. The pleasure of a work completed, a difficulty overcome, a truth arrived at through effort. The pleasure of being the kind of person who does not abandon others when it would be easier to walk away. Are these the same kind of thing as the pleasures of the body? Can they all be reduced to the same calculus? Can you simply weigh them against each other and choose the heavier one? The Harvard lecture on utilitarianism that you may have encountered asks something very similar. It asks whether the pleasure of Shakespeare is the same kind of thing as the pleasure of a game of pin-pins. Jeremy Bentham, the British utilitarian philosopher, said yes, that pleasures differ only in intensity and duration, not in kind. John Stuart Mill, refining utilitarianism, said no, that some pleasures are higher and that anyone who had experienced both would choose them. The Charvakas seem to have been roughly on the Bentham side of this question. Pleasure is pleasure. The direct experience of the body is the clearest and most verifiable form of it. Abstract pleasures, if they are real, can be reduced to the same hedonic currency. But even if you accept this, a problem remains. The pleasures of human beings are intensely relational. You do not experience the pleasure of a meal alone in exactly the same way you experience it with people you love. You do not experience the pleasure of being understood the same way you experience the pleasure of physical warmth. You do not experience the pleasure of having been honest in a difficult situation the same way you experience immediate sensory satisfaction. These pleasures are entangled with other people, with time, with the construction of a self over years of choices. A philosophy that takes pleasure as its only measure has to account for the fact that some of the most reliable pleasures available to human beings are not extractable from the web of relationship, responsibility, and time. They require exactly the kind of commitment and sacrifice that pure hedonism seems to rule out. This is not a refutation of Charvaka. It is an invitation to think harder about what pleasure actually is. Even a dead fish can swim downstream, but swimming upstream, toward the things that are worth having rather than the things that are easy to take, requires something more than the path of least resistance. It requires a theory of what upstream means, and who decides, and whether there is any compass that does not rely on the unverifiable. The Charvakas asked how we know what is real. That question does not go away just because we resist their answer. Dismiss the Charvakas as an ancient curiosity, and you will miss how thoroughly their questions have reasserted themselves in the modern world. The 20th century, in every part of the globe, watched the systematic collapse of inherited religious authority as the organizing principle of public life. Not because anyone sat down and argued philosophy with the priests, but because the conditions that sustained the authority changed. Education became broadly accessible. The mechanisms of nature became explicable through science. The institutional failures of religious organizations became visible and documented. And millions of people found themselves in the position the Charvaka had occupied 2,500 years earlier, standing in a world that the traditional explanations no longer adequately described, asking what was actually true. The materialist answer, the one the Charvakas gave first, became the dominant answer of the modern scientific worldview. Consciousness is what the brain does. There is no evidence for the soul. Death is final. The meaning of life is not prescribed from outside, but constructed by the living from whatever materials are available. This is not identical to Charvaka. The modern scientific worldview has its own complexities, its own debates about consciousness and identity and the limits of inference. But the basic orientation toward the observable world as the only world that can be known, toward pleasure and suffering as the raw material of ethics rather than abstract metaphysical obligations, toward skepticism of authority that cannot be questioned, these are recognizably Charvaka in spirit. And here is the paradox. The tradition that was destroyed in ancient India because it threatened the institutions of power has become, in secular form, the default worldview of the educated class in the most powerful societies on earth. The priests won every argument and lost the world. The materialists were burned by mantras and came back anyway, not as a school, but as an atmosphere. What did they do with this victory? It is worth asking honestly. The Charvaka promised that a philosophy without karma would be more honest. That people living without the pressure of cosmic reward and punishment would be freer and more authentic. That skepticism of authority would make society more just. In some ways, this has been true. The decline of religious authority over public life in many parts of the world has been accompanied by real expansions of human freedom. Freedom to marry whom you choose, to think what you believe, to dissent from the majority without being burned for it. These are not nothing. They are enormously valuable. But the Charvaka also did not fully account for something. When you remove the cosmic scaffolding, the question of how to live together does not answer itself. Human beings need some story about what matters and why. The secular world has struggled to construct one that works as well as the old stories did, at generating the kind of social cohesion that allows people to trust each other across time. The grief of the modern world is not that people have stopped believing. It is that many people have stopped believing and discovered that the secular alternatives are not automatically filling the gap, that the pleasure of individual freedom, real as it is, does not automatically generate the sense of meaning that makes the harder parts of being alive feel worth enduring. We see this in the epidemics of loneliness that run through the most materially prosperous societies in history. We see it in the resurgence of extreme political ideologies that function like substitute religions, offering absolute frameworks, sacred enemies, a sense of participation in something larger than the individual self. We see it in the anxious productivity of people who have everything the Charvaka prescription would seem to recommend: comfort, freedom, pleasure available on demand, and who nevertheless report feeling hollow at the center. The Charvaka tradition said, "The priests are wrong about the soul, and everything built on that error should be questioned." This was true and important. But the tradition did not say what to build in the space left by the questioning. It assumed that honest perception of the world would be sufficient to generate a livable life. And the experience of the modern world suggests that this assumption needs more work. Honest perception of what is actually in front of you is the beginning of wisdom. But human beings also need stories. Not false stories. Not stories that require you to believe what cannot be verified. But narratives that locate you in time, that connect your experience to something larger than the span of one body's life, that give your choices weight beyond their immediate hedonic consequences. The Charvakas burned the stories they found dishonest. The modern world has continued that work. The question the 21st century is living through is whether it is possible to build new stories that are honest about what they are, that do not claim divine authority or cosmic necessity, but that still do the work that stories have always done for human beings. The work of meaning, the work of coherence, the work of making the effort of a lifetime feel like something. This is not a question the Charvakas asked, but it is the question their legacy has left us. The one who dismantles the corrupt temple has made something possible. What gets built in its place is a separate project and a harder one. There are many roads that lead to the top of the mountain, as a piece of indigenous wisdom reminds us. But the view from the top is the same. The Charvakas climbed one road and told everyone else the roads they were taking were leading nowhere. They may have been right, but they were so busy pointing backward at the bad roads that they did not always look carefully at where their own feet were going. This is not a reason to ignore what they found. It is a reason to carry it forward with more care than they had time to take. One detail in the historical record of Charvaka stops you cold when you encounter it. In the 16th century, the Mughal Emperor Akbar convened a symposium of philosophers of every tradition at his court. The court historian Abu al-Fadl summarized the Charvaka position as he understood it, and in his summary, he included this description of how the Charvakas understood paradise and hell. Paradise, for the Charvaka, was the state in which a person lives as they choose, without control by another. Hell was the state in which a person lives subject to another's will. That is the entire afterlife theology. Heaven is autonomy, hell is domination. There is no cosmic geography here. No reward for virtue, no punishment for wickedness, no omniscient judge keeping accounts. What determines whether your life is paradise or hell is not your relationship to any transcendent reality. It is your relationship to your own agency, whether you are free to be the author of your own life or whether that authorship has been taken from you. This is a strikingly modern formulation. It resonates with things that political philosophers and psychologists and activists across the 20th and 21st centuries have said, sometimes without knowing they were echoing a 2,000-year-old tradition from the other side of the world. What is interesting is what this definition implies about the obligations you have to others. If paradise is autonomy, then the worst thing you can do to someone is take their autonomy. And this suggests that even a philosophy without karma or divine judgment can generate a genuine ethics, not through abstract obligation, but through the logical extension of what you value for yourself. You want to live as you choose, so does everyone else. The social arrangement that best preserves your paradise is one that also preserves theirs. You do not need God to tell you that domination is wrong. You can reason your way there from the simple observation that you do not want to be dominated, and that others are exactly like you in this respect. This is a limited ethics. It does not automatically generate compassion for distant strangers. It does not obviously produce the kind of sacrificial love that some of the great religious traditions celebrate. But it is honest, and it is not nothing. And it raises a question that is worth carrying into sleep. If paradise is living as you choose, and if this life is the only one you get, then what are you choosing? Not what are you supposed to be choosing, or what the tradition says you should be choosing, or what your parents chose, or what is expected. What are you actually, right now, choosing? And is it the thing you would choose if you knew with complete certainty that there is no next time? We do not know what the Charvakas said when they were at their most sophisticated. We have fragments. We have hostility filtered through paraphrase. We have the shape of arguments preserved in the responses of those who defeated them, at least institutionally, without ever fully defeating the questions. But imagine for a moment that the Bahaspatya Sutras survived. Imagine a complete text, the original arguments, the worked examples, the responses to objections. What might it contain? It would probably contain a more careful treatment of the inference problem than the fragments suggest. The fragments we have pushed toward a strict empiricism that seems to deny any inference at all, which is clearly too strong. You need inference to navigate even the most ordinary practical life. The actual position was probably more nuanced, distinguishing between inference grounded in observed regularities and inference used to reach conclusions about things that have never been observed. It would probably contain a more developed ethics than the hedonist caricature suggests. The fragments tell you to seek pleasure and avoid pain. But a philosophical tradition capable of sustained intellectual engagement would have addressed the hard cases. What do you do when your pleasure conflicts with another person's? How do you adjudicate between present and future pleasures? What role does social cooperation play in a philosophy of individual well-being? It would probably contain a more careful treatment of consciousness than we have. The fermentation analogy is striking, but it is clearly a beginning rather than an end. The opponents pressed hard on the question of consciousness, and the Charvakas responded, but we do not have those responses. What we have instead is the conversation with those responses removed. We have the refutations without the thing being refuted. This is like trying to understand a debate by listening to only one side, and knowing that the side you are listening to has strong reasons to misrepresent the other. And yet, even in this partial form, the tradition is remarkably alive. The questions it asked are still open. The challenge to unverifiable authority is still relevant. The demand to ground ethics in something actually observable rather than something assumed is still unsatisfied. The Charvakas lost, but they were not wrong to ask. The Charvaka tradition has a name that may derive from the Sanskrit word for to chew, Charvaka, the chewer. The one who chews, the one whose words are something you bite into, not something that dissolves into sweetness. There is something in this image worth following. What does it mean to chew on an idea rather than swallow it? Every tradition that asks for belief asks you, in some sense, to swallow, to take the doctrine whole, to accept the framework and operate within it. The sacred texts say this is true. The lineage of teachers confirms it. The community of practice reinforces it. To question is to spit out what you have been given, and this is not welcome. The Charvaka impulse is to chew, to take the idea and work it in your teeth, to ask what it is made of, to find out whether it falls apart under pressure or holds together, to determine whether its flavor is what you were told it would be. This is not comfortable. Chewing is more work than swallowing, and it generates much more conflict. The person who chews is a problem for the person who needs you to swallow, but there is a kind of nutrition that you only get from chewing. Understanding that has passed through the full action of your own mind rather than being received whole from someone else's. The Charvakas were asking everyone around them to chew on the doctrines they had been given, to hold the ideas of soul and karma and divine revelation in their minds and work them, asking what they were actually made of, where they came from, who benefited from their acceptance. This is what made them dangerous. Not the conclusions they reached. The act of asking. A question seriously asked is its own kind of freedom. You can bind someone's body, limit their movement, control their social position. But if you have given them the habit of asking what is actually true, you have given them something that does not stay inside the boundaries you draw for it. This is probably why the texts were burned. If you take Charvaka seriously, all the way seriously, you arrive at a place that is both very clear and very strange. Nothing transcendent can be known with certainty. The soul is unverifiable. Karma is unverifiable. The afterlife is unverifiable. The authority of sacred texts is circular. The institutional claims of religion rest on assumptions that cannot be tested. What remains? The warmth of the body. The fact of experience. The people in front of you. The food in your hands. The pleasure of understanding something, even if what you understand is how little you understand. The particular texture of this moment, which is the only moment you can be completely sure exists. This is not nothing. In certain moods, at certain hours, it is actually overwhelming. The sheer facticity of being here, of being conscious, of perceiving and feeling and thinking in the middle of a universe that did not have to contain any of this at all. The Charvakas were pointing at this. They were saying, before you spend your life pursuing a transcendence you cannot verify, notice what is actually here. Notice the full, astonishing, temporary fact of being alive right now. The person who truly inhabits this moment, without retreating into hope for a better next life or guilt about a worse previous one, is doing something that is harder than it sounds. The mind, even without religious scaffolding, tends toward projection, toward imagining how things could be different, might have been different, should be different. The discipline of full presence, of actually being in the body, in the moment, in the breath, is real discipline. The Charvakas were not advocating laziness. The philosophy of pleasure, seriously lived, requires you to be awake enough to actually experience the pleasure that is available, rather than sleepwalking through it while chasing something that was promised to you by someone who needed your trust. Be here. Feel this. Ask what is actually true. Question the one who tells you to look away. This is the core of the Charvaka legacy, the part that survived the burning of the texts, the hostility of the commentators, the passage of 25 centuries. And it is still asking something from you tonight, lying quietly in whatever darkness you are currently in. The name Lokayata means the philosophy of the people, the view held by common people, the worldview of the ordinary world. This is significant. Other schools of Indian philosophy carried names that positioned them as specialized, esoteric, for the learned. The Charvaka tradition carried a name that said it belonged to everyone, and there is historical evidence that this was not merely a name. The Charvaka perspective was popular, not among the philosophers and priests and court intellectuals who wrote the texts that survive, but among traders, craftspeople, people of the lower castes, people who experienced the Brahmin system not as cosmic order, but as an arrangement in which they did the work and the priests received the merit. A philosophy that says the priest's ritual does nothing that the seasons and the soil and the labor of your hands do not already do, is a philosophy with obvious appeal to the people performing the labor. A philosophy that says your suffering now is not the just payment of karmic debt is a philosophy with obvious appeal to the people who are told their suffering is their own fault, deserved, cosmic, and therefore unchangeable. A philosophy that says the only good that can be verified is the good of this life, and that this life should be lived rather than sacrificed for an unverifiable future, is a philosophy with obvious appeal to people who have very little to sacrifice and a great deal to lose. The Charvaka was, among other things, a philosophy of descent from below. And it was destroyed, in large part, by the people it descended from. This is not unusual in history. Philosophy that threatens power tends to be classified as the philosophy of the unserious, the low, the uneducated, the unrefined. Even the dismissal carries the logic of the system being defended. The materialists are called crude because materialism is the worldview of the people who work with material things, the hands, the body, the earth. The sophistication is reserved for the people who think about the things above material things, the priests, the philosophers, the people who do not work with their hands. There is a line from the Charvaka fragments that, even filtered through hostile commentary, has the feel of something said by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. It describes a man who, when he sees that priests are prospering from their rituals and their knowledge, decides to study those rituals and that knowledge. And it observes that this man is wise. He has understood the actual structure of the game. The knowledge is not sacred. The rituals are not cosmic. But they are socially powerful, and social power is real, regardless of its metaphysical justification. But Charvaka advice was not to ignore this. It was to see it clearly, to understand what the game actually is before deciding how to play it. This is still useful advice. Revisit the demon in the Mahabharata one more time. Consider what kind of courage it requires to stand in the court of a newly crowned king, surrounded by priests who have just declared his victory divinely sanctioned, and say, "What you have done is not glorious." What you have done is exactly what it looks like. The story frames Charvaka as a demon. It has to. Within the moral universe of the Mahabharata, the Great War had to have been justified. The deaths had to have been necessary. The suffering had to have served something. The righteous had to have prevailed over the unrighteous. Any voice that refused this framing, that simply described what actually happened without the ritual redemption of mythological context, had to be something outside the category of the acceptable. In every human society, there are truths that are too destabilizing to be named directly. Not because they are secret, but because naming them directly would require dismantling the story that makes collective life possible. The king cannot hold the court while the court acknowledges that the king is a man who ordered thousands of deaths. The priest cannot perform the ritual while the congregation acknowledges that the ritual has no mechanism of action beyond the social agreement to treat it as powerful. The Charvaka tradition, by asking, "How do you actually know that?" at every point, was perpetually on the verge of this kind of destabilization. Not because its proponents were demons. Because their question, taken seriously, does not stop at one institution or one doctrine. It spreads. How do you know the ritual works? How do you know the priest's authority is legitimate? How do you know the caste system is just? How do you know the king's victory was righteous? How do you know the texts that say all of this are what they claim to be? These questions are connected. Pull one thread, and the whole fabric starts to move. This is why the response is always to burn the demon, not to answer the question. Because the question is not wrong. It is just inconveniently timed. The Charvaka tradition begins with a single observation. What I perceive is real. What I cannot perceive cannot be proven. It ends, in the fullness of its implications, with a world that is entirely this world, this body, this breath. This moment of awareness in the dark, whatever its content, whatever its quality, there is no soul traveling toward liberation. There is this. There is no karma accounting for what you did in a life you do not remember. There is this. There is no priest whose ritual can change the direction of anything beyond the social reality that his ritual creates. There is this. The Charvakas said that all of this, fully inhabited, is enough. Whether they were right is a question you cannot answer tonight. It may not be answerable at all. The Brahmin philosophers who spent centuries arguing against the Charvakas were not obviously wrong in their objections. The Buddhist philosophers who pressed hard on the Charvaka account of consciousness were asking genuinely difficult questions. The tradition of Indian thought that insisted on something beyond the physical was not merely protecting institutional interests. It was also responding to something real in human experience, the sense that this cannot be all there is, that the fact of consciousness is stranger and more significant than a combination of elements can fully explain. But the Charvakas were also not wrong to ask. And the fact that their asking was found so threatened enough to justify the destruction of an entire philosophical tradition, suggests that the questions touched something that the people with the power to destroy texts knew they could not answer. All of this lives in the dark now, in the silence of a tradition we can only access through the words of its enemies. There is still a question in that silence. What do you actually know? What can you actually verify? And what are you willing to do with the honest answer? You do not have to solve it tonight. The question will wait. Questions of this kind have a way of persisting. Tonight, let your body rest. Let your breathing slow. Let the weight of the body remind you that you are, at least undeniably, here. What you make of here is the whole story. There is a cost to the Charvaka way of looking at the world that rarely gets acknowledged in either the hostile summaries or the sympathetic reconstructions. If you genuinely accept that perception is the only valid source of knowledge, and if you genuinely accept that this life is the only one you can verify, and if you genuinely accept that pleasure is the ground of all value, then you have given up something that most human beings find it very hard to live without. You have given up the story. Not any particular story. The structure of story itself. The narrative shape that says your present suffering connects to a future reward. That your choices in this moment will matter in a context larger than the moment itself. That what you do here and now is part of something that will eventually make sense from a perspective you cannot yet occupy. Human beings are, at the deepest level, storytelling animals. The capacity for narrative is not a luxury or a decoration added to the cognitive architecture of the species. It is central to how human minds process experience. We do not merely perceive what happens to us. We construct what happens to us into sequences with causes and consequences, with purposes and meanings, with a past that explains the present and a future that gives the present its significance. The Charvaka tradition, by insisting that only direct perception is valid, is asking you to live in a world stripped of this narrative dimension, the present moment fully inhabited. The pleasure and pain of direct experience, honestly assessed. No cosmic story in which your suffering has been assigned a redemptive role. No divine plan in which your confusion is a step in a pattern that will eventually be revealed as meaningful. This is, in a certain sense, the bravest possible way to live. It is also, for most human beings, an essentially impossible one. The philosophers who followed the Charvaka line in the modern West, the strict empiricists, the logical positivists, the thinkers who insisted that meaningful statements had to be verifiable in principle, they discovered something important. The life they were describing was not actually livable in the terms they described it. Even the most committed empiricist tells stories. Even the most rigorous materialist has a narrative about who they are, where they come from, what they are trying to accomplish, and why. These narratives cannot be reduced to direct perception. They are inferences, interpretations, constructions, and the strict Charvaka epistemology would have to deny them. There is a kind of perverse irony in this. The Charvaka tradition preserved itself through narratives. The story of Brihaspati founding the school, the story of the demon in the Mahabharata, the fragments quoted in order to be refuted, which have the shape of arguments being made to someone, arguments that presuppose a context, a tradition, a line of thinking that connects the speaker to those who came before. The Charvakas were not just perceiving, they were also telling stories. They were also building a tradition. They were also participating in exactly the kind of narrative that their epistemology seemed to rule out. This is not a refutation of the Charvaka position. It is an observation about the limits of any philosophy that tries to evacuate narrative from human experience. The question is not whether stories are necessary. They clearly are. The question is whether the stories we tell are honest, whether they are stories we have examined or stories we have merely inherited, whether we are the authors of our own narratives or characters in someone else's. The Charvaka was asking for authorship, for the right to examine the story you have been given and decide, with clear eyes, whether it is the story you want to live in. This is a genuinely valuable thing to ask for. It is not the same as having no story at all. To understand why Charvaka attracted so much hostility, you have to understand how deeply karma was embedded in the social logic of ancient India. Karma was not, in its original form, simply a system of divine reward and punishment. It was a description of a mechanism. Every action creates consequences. Those consequences ripple forward through time. The being that you are now is the product of the actions taken by your previous selves. The being you will become is being shaped by the actions you take now. This is, stripped of its metaphysical commitments, actually a reasonable description of how causality works. Your current character was shaped by your past choices. Your future character will be shaped by your present ones. The habits you build now determine the options available to you later. The relationships you maintain or damage today will determine the quality of your social world tomorrow. The Charvaka objection to karma was not primarily to this pattern of consequence. It was to the extension of that pattern across the barrier of death. You cannot observe the mechanism that connects your actions in this life to your birth conditions in a next one. You cannot verify that there is a next one. You cannot even verify that there was a previous one, since you have no memory of it. But here is where it gets complicated. The Brahminical extension of karma across multiple lifetimes served a social function that went far beyond theology. It told people why the world was the way it was. It explained inequality, suffering, social hierarchy, in terms that located their cause in the past actions of the sufferer, rather than in the current actions of those who benefit from the hierarchy. If you are poor, it is because of what you did before. If you are oppressed, it is the working out of cosmic justice for actions you no longer remember. The appropriate response is not to challenge the arrangement, but to perform your dharma. Your duty is determined by your caste position, so that your karma improves for the next life. From this angle, karma is not merely a theory about the soul. It is a political technology, a mechanism for transforming social discontent into individual self-examination. A way of directing the energy of suffering inward rather than outward. The Charvakas named this. They pointed at the social function of the doctrine and said, "Who benefits from this belief?" The answer was visible. The people who did not benefit from it were the people living at the bottom of the hierarchy, accepting their conditions as deserved. The people who did benefit were the priests who managed the system, and the upper castes whose position it justified. This does not mean karma is false. A doctrine can be politically convenient and also true. But the Charvaka argument was that the convenience is a reason to look carefully, to ask what the evidence actually shows, to notice that the mechanism cannot be observed, and that the people asking you to trust it are exactly the people who benefit from your trust. This was not merely philosophy. It was social critique of the most fundamental kind, and the response to it was not philosophical refutation, but social destruction. The people at the top of the karmic hierarchy, destroyed the texts of the people who questioned whether there was a karmic hierarchy. They did not defeat the argument. They erased the arguer, and then they wrote histories in which the erased were demons. This pattern also has not confined itself to ancient India. Chapter 21. What Brihaspati might have said. Let us imagine, for a moment, that the Brihaspatiya Sutras survived. That you are reading the original, unfiltered Charvaka philosophy rather than the hostile summary. What might it have sounded like? Perhaps it would have begun with a simple observation. Of all the things you've been told to believe, how many have you actually seen, not heard about? Not inferred, seen with the eyes that are yours, in the lifetime that is the only one you can be certain you have. Perhaps it would have moved through the specific claims of Vedic religion, examining each one with the same patient, devastating question: where is the evidence? Not where is the authority who asserts it. Where is the thing itself, available to direct inspection? Perhaps it would have addressed the objection that perception is limited, that the senses can be deceived, that there are realities too subtle for the ordinary organs of sensation to detect. Yes, the Charvaka might have said, all of this is true, but when you move beyond the senses without any tether to sensory evidence, you do not arrive at a more reliable knowledge. You arrive at a space where anything can be asserted, where the only check on a claim is whether it pleases the person making it or serves the person paying for it. Perhaps it would have said something about pleasure that went beyond the crude hedonism its opponents described. Something like, the life that is lived in the body, with full attention to what the body actually experiences, with honest acknowledgement of both pleasure and pain, with clear-eyed assessment of the costs and benefits of every major choice, is not a lesser life than the life lived in pursuit of unverifiable transcendence. It is in many ways a harder one. Because it requires you to be present for what is actually happening, rather than comforting yourself with stories about what will happen after this is over. Perhaps it would have ended with something like this. There are many roads that lead to the mountain's top, but they all require you to actually walk. The road that consists of sitting still and imagining the summit is not a road at all. Get up, open your eyes. Feel what there is to feel, and do not let anyone else tell you what your experience means until you have sat with it long enough to know what it means yourself. We will never know what Brihaspati actually wrote. The burning was thorough, but we can note that the questions he was asking are questions that every generation rediscovers. Not because they come from him, because they come from the most basic and stubborn feature of honest human thinking, which is the refusal to stop asking just because the asking is inconvenient. Chapter 22. The Sleep of Reason. There is an image by the Spanish painter Goya that is often described as one of the defining images of the Enlightenment. A man slumped over a desk, asleep, while the darkness behind him fills with owls and bats. The caption reads, "The sleep of reason produces monsters." The Charvakas would have recognized this image immediately. Not because they were European Enlightenment thinkers, but because the concern is the same. The monsters are what move into the space when you stop asking. When you accept what you have been given without examination. When you inherit a worldview wholesale and live inside it without ever pressing on the walls to see if they hold. The monsters of the ancient Indian world were not literally the flying creatures in Goya's image. They were the consequences of unchallenged systems. The man condemned to a lifetime of degraded labor because of a birth that karma designated as the outcome of a previous life he cannot remember. The woman whose personhood was circumscribed by texts she was not permitted to read or question. The village that went hungry because the resources it produced were diverted toward rituals that the ritual performers insisted were cosmically necessary. The Charvakas pressed on the walls. They said, "These constructions were built by people, and the people who built them benefited from them, and that is a reason to look at them very carefully before accepting them as permanent features of the universe. This is the work that is never fully done." Every generation inherits a set of arrangements that the previous generation has normalized. Every generation is told that the way things are is the way they have to be, that the hierarchies and exclusions and accepted suffering are the product of forces too fundamental to challenge. And in every generation, there are people who press on the walls. Sometimes the pressing reveals genuine structure. Sometimes what seemed arbitrary turns out to have a reason. Sometimes the walls hold because they are load-bearing. The Charvakas were not right about everything, and their method of pressing, the insistence that only direct perception could be trusted, was too strict to actually live by. The human project of understanding requires inference and testimony and tradition, carefully handled. But the instinct is right. Press. Ask. Notice who benefits from your not asking. Notice what remains when you have asked everything you can think to ask. And then, having noticed all of that, make your choices with whatever remains. This is what makes a person free. Not the absence of constraints, but the honest inventory of which constraints are real, and which are stories told by the people who profit from your compliance. The Charvakas were fearless in this inventory. They paid an enormous price for their fearlessness. And the questions they were asking are still, right now, in the dark where you are lying, waiting to be asked. Chapter 23. Closing. In the centuries after the Charvaka tradition disappeared as a living school, something curious happened. The questions it asked did not disappear with it. They kept surfacing in different forms, in different contexts, in the works of poets and dissenters, and philosophical outliers who probably had never heard of Brihaspati, but who found themselves arriving at similar places by different roads. The tradition of Indian poetry known as the Bhakti movement, which flourished from roughly the 6th to the 17th century, was in many ways the opposite of Charvaka, intensely devotional, focused on personal union with the divine, rejecting caste and ritual, not because they were metaphysically groundless, but because the direct experience of love for God made them irrelevant. But there is a thread connecting these apparently opposite traditions. Both were expressions of skepticism toward the institutional Brahmin establishment. Both insisted that the individual's direct experience was more authoritative than mediated authority. Both attracted followers from lower caste backgrounds, who had every reason to distrust a system in which the gatekeeping of spiritual truth was the exclusive property of the people who had most to gain from that gatekeeping. The great Bhakti poet Kabir, born in the 15th century into a family of Muslim weavers, made jokes at the expense of both Hindu priests and Muslim clerics that would have pleased a Charvaka immensely. Kabir asked what the Vedas and the Quran actually knew that direct experience could not teach. He asked whether a man became holy by wearing the right clothes. He asked who actually benefits from your adherence to rules that someone else established. He did not arrive at Charvaka materialism. He arrived somewhere else, somewhere that kept the transcendent but rejected the institutional monopoly on it. But the questions were familiar. This is what happens to philosophical traditions when their texts are destroyed. The tradition does not end. The questions do not become unavailable. They keep emerging through independent discovery, through the same basic intellectual operations applied to the same basic human situation. The Charvakas pressed on the walls. The walls were broken. The rubble was cleared away, and the people who came after pressed again on whatever walls were available, arriving at some of the same places and some different ones. This is the permanent condition of honest thinking. It is never finished. Every age inherits a new set of unexamined assumptions and needs its own version of the person who says, "But how do you know?" Every age has its priests and its demons. And the ones who get called demons tend to be the ones asking the questions that the priests cannot afford to answer honestly. The wheel has no beginning, and it has no end that we can see from where we are. But each turn of it carries the same impulse forward, the refusal of a certain kind of slumber. The insistence on waking up to what is actually there, even if it costs you everything, even if the mantras are already forming on the lips of the people with the power to destroy you. Even then, the question was worth asking.